In an hour's time, our grand tour today takes us to Fez. But now it's 9:05 and it's time for this morning's election call. Here's Jonathan Dimbleby.
Good morning and welcome to Election Call, where this morning, both on BBC One and on Radio 4, it is your election call to the leader of the Labour Party, Neil Kinnock, the man who would be Prime Minister if you take his advice the day after tomorrow and turn the Labour Party into the Labour government. The lines are still open. The number to ring, as always, is 071 799 5000. Our first caller is on the line, Bill Bullingham from Cheltenham. Your election call to Mr. Kinnock.
Good morning, Mr. Kinnock.
Good morning, Mr. Bullingham.
If you don't get the growth in the economy you, Mr. Smith, and your colleagues are expecting, who will foot the bill for your extra spending and promises that you've made to the electorate?
Thanks very much. Well, we will get the growth in the economy, and I think you may have seen in the newspapers over the past 2 days particularly, the independent analysts, not just the National Institute, but the London Business School and so on, who have demonstrated that the rate of growth under the Labour government, because of our policies, will be higher than that of the Conservative government, and consequently we'll be generating the additional wealth, the additional revenue. I think too it would be fair to take into account the record of Labour governments over the years, which on trend have had higher rates of growth than what's been achieved over the average of the last 13 years. So far as our expenditure commitments are concerned, we've been very particular, very specific about those that we shall immediately put into effect, which of course are fully funded, and then all else depends upon the capacity to pay and upon resources being available. We've made that clear on every one of the policies, and I think people now understand that.
Mr. Bullingham.
With respect, Mr. Kinnock, you haven't answered the question. What happens if you don't get growth? I'm a businessman, and when I prepare a business plan, I have to look for situation if things don't work out as expected. What emergency plans have you got if you don't get the growth?
If it doesn't happen as you'd like it to happen, and as you believe it will happen.
Well, I made it clear that our business plan, and I thought this would be conveyed, but I'm glad to repeat it, is that we will spend what the country can afford, and that provision, to use a phrase I've previously used, must come out of improved performance. It is our commitment to improvement of that performance that is one of the reasons why we're confident we will generate the additional growth. And so consequently, apart from those commitments that we immediately have, we also have, as I've made clear, that absolute theme running through all our proposals, repeated by myself and John Smith on many occasions, that we shall be cutting our coat according to our cloth, and not then coming back and asking, as the Tories have had to do, for additional shovelfuls of taxation, as they've done with a high burden of taxation, in order to try and fund their programmes.
Mr. Bullingham, thank you very much. We've got masses of calls coming through. I'm going to move on now to James Sinclair from London. Your election call, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Kinnock.
Good morning, Mr. Sinclair.
There's a quotation by Hilaire Belloc that says that it is the business of the wealthy man to give employment to the artisan. I'm an artisan, like many other small businessmen who rely for my employment on people who can afford the icing on the cake. Under your taxation plans, the vast majority of my customers will be subject to a considerable loss of income. As a result, I'm in danger of losing at least 40 to 50% of my business. How will your taxation plans, which are intended to help people like myself earning less than £21,000 a year, compensate for this loss of business, and how will they help the people who I will have to make redundant, the suppliers I buy materials from, etc., etc.? The chain seems to me to be endless.
Thanks very much. You could tell me which particular line of business you're in, but I'll be happy to hear that. But I must say that unless, as you put it, the vast majority of your customers are people earning well in excess of £21,000 a year, then they will be beneficiaries of the changes that we are making in taxation and in child benefit, because as the Institute of Fiscal Studies has shown, 8 out of 10 families in Britain will be direct beneficiaries of the changes that we shall make. 1 in 10 families will not be either gainers or losers, and something slightly less than 1 in 10 families will actually be paying some more as a consequence of the changes we are making in the top rate of taxation, chargeable on over £40,000 a year, and on the 9% national insurance charge, which will be paid on all of people's income and not just on their income up to £21,000. So I think that you can be confident that our changes in taxation, far from being deflationary, far from pushing down demand for your services and what you produce, will actually be at the margin slightly reflationary it'll actually increase demand because of the better distribution of income.
Reassured, Mr. Sinclair?
No, I'm afraid not. I mean, I'm a landscape gardener. All of my clients, bar a very few, do earn more than £21,000 a year. Landscape gardening is not exactly the sort of thing that is essential. It is something that is nice and that improves the quality of life. What your taxation plans appear to be doing is taking away people's choice to have that quality of life improved. I mean, there's nothing better than a nice garden as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm a keen gardener myself, and I wish I had a bigger garden in which to work. But I think that it's worth taking into account the fact that without having any malice at all to people who, like myself, earn more than £21,000 a year, that they put a value on your services, that they pay for your services. But if you're asking about choice, then I think it's very important to add to the choice of the pensioner couple, for instance, to whom we'll pay an extra £8 a week, or the single pensioner an extra £5 a week, or the choice of the overwhelming majority of families who, if they have children, will be getting the full rate of child benefit on all children instead of just on the first child. And I recognize and sympathize with the fact that you may feel some additional pressure, but I'm sure that you recognize too the importance of organizing a fair tax structure, which means that the social bills of our society can be met, and so too that we can make additional investment in health and in education, all valuable to society.
Mr. Kinnock, would you accept that in the South, and our caller comes from the South, where the average male earning is somewhere around 21,000, that there are a great many people above that level who will have a deflationary effect as on their income as a consequence of the changes?
The fact is that if we're talking about groupings in the population, there are far more people, even in the South, of course, who are earning less than £21,000, less than £220 a week.
But those who are above, the people who are above, insofar as it will stimulate the incomes of those who are below to spend, it will have a deflationary effect, you would acknowledge, on those above.
No, that isn't the case, because were it the case that we were simply taking out of the economy the extra tax and national insurance that people on over £21,000 a year will pay, yes, it would be deflationary. But of course, every pound that's taken out from there is going back in for that 80% majority of the population.
But those individuals will spend less, won't they?
Well, no, of course they won't.
No, the individuals on the high level, sorry, the ones above 21,000 are going to spend less, they're going to have less.
But in the economy, more will be spent for the very simple reason that the people who are on those incomes below £21,000 a year have what the economists call a higher marginal propensity to consume. In other words, they spend more of the money that is available to them. So in a recession, the effect is a further injection into the domestic economy, possibly greater, not hugely greater, but certainly greater than that which would be spent in the economy if the money was going to the people over £21,000 a year.
Mr. Sinclair, thank you very much. And now Colin Hooker from London.
In his shadow budget, Mr. Smith indicated that Labour's proposals would stimulate investment and aid economic recovery. Since then, we have seen the stock market fall by over 4%. Gilt-edged stocks have tumbled, fearing a rise in interest rates if Labour were to win the election. In addition, building society chiefs believe that the proposals would increase repossessions through higher interest rates and personal taxation. Business leaders overwhelmingly believe that the proposals would increase unemployment and make industry more uncompetitive. What makes Mr. Kinnock think that a Labour government can fly in the face of these indicators and authoritative opinions?
First, thanks very much, Mr. Hooker. I think that the Prime Minister gave a fair explanation of the various fluctuations on the stock exchange when he said that one of the great inhibitions to confidence and also, obviously, to the markets is the fact that we're having a general election. I'd simply add that one of the problems is there's greater fragility because we had to wait so long for a general election. But I'm certain that all of the commercial and industrial companies can be confident that performance under the Labour government will be better than, for instance, the last year under the Conservative government, when for only the second time in history, the services sector shrunk by 1.6%. We had a fall in manufacturing, so there was negative growth in manufacturing. And the actions of the Labour government will mean that there is a real stimulus to the productive and service sectors of the economy, which will enable companies to make higher profits, obviously, to employ more people, and to increase the value of their shares. So I hope that they act clinically, whatever the personal political opinions of the people who are operating in the markets. I hope that they will act clinically and look for the best fortune for their companies, because ultimately, of course, that is helpful to the economic well-being of the nation. Can I just say one other thing on this question of housing? and what you describe as the building society chiefs. The first thing is, of course, so far as the housing market is concerned, it's driven by first-time buyers. First-time buyers in Britain, according to the independent analysts, have an income of £18,000 a year on average. Everybody on that kind of income and well above it will benefit from Labour's budget, so hopefully we can get a boost to the most vital part of the housing market. And I'm sure that on examination, many more people will understand that that's the area in which we need to have the greatest support in order to lift the housing market from its present comatose state where it's been put by the actions of the current Conservative government.
Mr. Hooker?
Well, everybody seems to be agreed that the introduction of a minimum wage would destroy jobs, not increase jobs. That's the first point. And the second point is that in The Economist this week, there is a table which clearly sets out that Labour's proposed plans, in fact, are going to take a much higher tax rate from everybody, not only the higher earners, but the lower earners as well.
Yes, well, we can dispute that, but of course that would be much better had I the Economist table in front of me. But I'll concentrate on the major point, since this is what the Conservatives frequently bring up, this question of the minimum wage. First of all, of course, all our competitors, our major competitors in the European community, other than the Republic of Ireland, have a national minimum wage arrangement. And certainly you could not describe them as being less successful than our economy. Certainly you could not say that their minimum wage arrangements have generated a rise in unemployment. Indeed, the biggest studies that have been done on France, for instance, have demonstrated that contrary to the preconceptions of those who did the study, the OECD, there was no addition to unemployment as a consequence of their introduction of the national minimum wage. I think it also worth remembering that in Britain, when equal pay was introduced, the Equal Pay Act was introduced, there were lots of warnings for months, indeed years beforehand, that that would effectively exterminate employment for women, because they said that employers wouldn't pay it. But of course, in the years since, there's been a massive increase in the employment of women. So I think that some of the fears that we're hearing are genuinely scare stories. Others come from misinformation, and I've got a great deal more time for those. But I'm sure that when experience provides instruction, people will see that the justice of the national minimum wage also proves to be economically efficient, as it has been elsewhere.
Mr. Kinnock, isn't it the case, though, that the OECD does say of France that they believe it had that the minimum wage was a contributory factor, that Henley forecast to the level of unemployment, that the
to youth unemployment,
to youth unemployment,
yes.
That Henley forecasting, that the National Institute have said, they vary the figures, they range between 80,000, 150,000 up to a maximum of 500,000, but they do say there is an adverse impact.
2 points there. The first thing is, yes, and I'm glad you pulled me up about it. The OECD study that concluded there was no increase in adult unemployment in France did say there was an increase in youth unemployment. But of course, because our national minimum wage will not apply to trainees, and that is to say the overwhelming majority of young people, then it won't have the same effect as it did in France. Secondly, so far as those analysts who have said that they will, over a period of years, 3 years I think is the figure, but I wouldn't be certain about that, be a marginal increase in unemployment, they don't take into effect two very important factors. One, the demand stimulus effect of paying the $3.40 an hour. And secondly, the additional revenues to the exchequer. Now, the Institute for Fiscal Studies says that that will be an addition 1.2 billion available then to the exchequer to put back into the economy, which will offset the effect of the national minimum wage. So the net effect is not to produce a rise in unemployment, and I don't quarrel with the analysts who have not all taken into account the demand stimulus effects of the national minimum wage.
Very small thing, just to pick you up
sure.
Again, however, is that youth, in the terms of the OECD, is defined as any worker under the age of 25. Your training schemes for youth do not apply to people who are above the age of 18 going on to 25, so that group in the OECD report is still, or would be affected in their case.
There can be that gap of years. However, it has to be said that if we treat those people as adult workers, as we do, and in France the experience in small businesses, which of course proliferate, and in other areas of the economy, has been that adult workers do not suffer additional unemployment as a consequence of the national minimum wage. I think it would only be fair to draw a similar conclusion in Britain.
Now Dr. Saeed Hassan from Nottingham, your election call to Mr. Kinnock.
Mr. Kinnock, I am a socialist by conviction, GP by profession, and fund holder by choice. Why are you going to deprive me of this choice, please?
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Is it Dr. Hassan or Dr. Hassan?
That'll be fine. Either will do.
Okay, fine.
You'll live with either.
Thanks very much. I can understand your motives under the present arrangements in the National Health Service with the current government in undertaking fund holding. I'm sure you'll be the first to acknowledge that you're one of about 14 or 1500 GPs out of the 25,000 general practitioners in Britain who's done so. And I can understand that given the opportunity of gaining access to slight increases in funds at the outset of fund holding, and given your understanding of the contract system with hospitals and hospital trusts, that you feel that you might be able to serve your patients better. Indeed, I'm sure you do feel that you would serve your patients better by operating fund holding. The difficulty would arise, would it not, if there was a universal acceptance of fund holding, that whilst it might be tolerable, I wouldn't agree with it, you do agree with it, but it might be tolerable for a margin of GPs to hold funds and to get a particular kind of access for their patients as a consequence of so doing. If every GP did it, then I think we'd see realised the fears expressed by the British Medical Association.
Dr. Hassan.
And that is of a kind of stock market where you have to act as a trader and not simply as a dedicated doctor.
No, I think if the object of my fund holding was to get a preferential treatment for my patient than of the patient of a colleague down the road, then I would accept your argument. But if the object is to influence the services of the local hospitals, the development of those services, then more fund holders there are, the better the effect will be.
How are you better able, Dr. Hassan, to influence the services as a fund holder than as an ordinary GP?
Well, for the very first time, we have been invited by the local hospital to, and they have asked us what we would like to do. We, for example, improve the quality of the service that the hospitals are offering, the waiting times, for example, the time it takes for the hospitals to respond, the time it takes for them to send us a discharge summary. You know, these may be very small points.
No, I think Mr. Kinnock think they're large points.
They're substantial points, which is exactly why, Dr. Hassan, and I'd be glad to send you a copy of our full document, we put a strong emphasis on better support for primary care and general practitioner services so that you can exercise the influence which is proper, I agree with you, on the strategy of hospitals and the responses of hospitals to community needs, but not have to rely upon the commercialization, and I use the word advisedly, of the system. Now, the other point is this. I'm glad that the hospital is taking notice of you and those colleagues who are fund holders, but again I put it to you, if that were the universal condition, and if every general practitioner in your area was having to operate on that basis of exercising influence by virtue of being a fund holder and establishing contracts with the hospital, then that would mean that you'd be back to square one, except that you would then have the additional obligation of acting, pardon the phrase, like a small business as well as a general practice. I applaud your intentions, and I just would like you, and I'm not in any way trying to teach my granny to suck eggs, but to extend the point beyond that small minority of GPs who currently are fund holders to the generality, which I'm sure you will appreciate, would change the very nature of the system and work against your excellent intentions.
Briefly on that, Dr. Hassan.
Well, you see, I come back to the same thing, that if there are more GPs are in the scheme, the more influence we will have, rather than the opposite.
Mr. Kinnock is suggesting that if everyone became fund holders, that advantage that you now have would disappear, the quasi-commercial advantage you have because of the power of your fund holding. You're saying it wouldn't disappear?
No, what I'm saying is that the advantage that we are seeking is to influence the development of the services
and
in
that's
our
right.
community.
That's appropriate.
And he does it because of his power, because he's a fund holder.
That's right. The more we are, the more the GPs there are, the more voice we have, the stronger it is, the more effect we will have on the outcome.
I will be very happy to send you our document, and I'm sure that you will acknowledge readily then that even though we might diverge in our opinions about fund holding, our purpose of giving proper emphasis and power to GPs delivering primary care and having to represent their patients in terms of hospitals and services is a better system because it doesn't rely on what Jonathan called the quasi-commercial relationship.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And now Nick Patterson from Farnborough in Hampshire.
Yes, Mr. Kinnock, I
Morning.
understand if you win the next election that all trust units within the NHS will be returned to the main fold of the NHS. What would happen if all the employees in a trust status actually wanted to stay trust status? I work for the Royal Berkshire Ambulance Service and we've applied for trust status. And the way it's going to work for the ambulance service, I personally think will be the best thing since sliced bread.
Well, I know that you'll realise that the vast majority of people working in the ambulance service in Britain would not take that point of view. And I speak not simply of ambulance personnel at the sharp end, but those who manage the service, who frequently, of course, are themselves experienced ambulance personnel. So far as the trusts are concerned, the problem is that they were in the ownership of the people generally, and they've been transferred to the boards of trusts by the Act of Parliament, which enables those boards to dispose of the assets as they will. They can buy what they like, sell what they like, charge what they like, hire who they like, fire who they like. And it means, therefore, that those trusts are detached from the national, I underline that word, health service.
Yes,
and I think that that will ultimately... Sorry?
At the moment, we are funded by a central unit.
Yes.
Now, if the Royal Berkshire Hospital or Battle Hospital overspend on their part of the budget, the first place they decide to claw it back from is from the ambulance service.
And they always will.
But if we have our own money, we can invest it, do our own income generation, train our own people to earn more money for the ambulance service, and it is then the sole responsibility of the ambulance service to spend it on the ambulance personnel and equipment.
Fine. Can I just ask you, Mr. Patterson, I realise that you are here to ask the questions and me to answer them, but I think
we can change the rules on this occasion.
Oh, fine. That would be of interest to other viewers and listeners, is what do you mean by income generation in an ambulance service?
What do I... Well, we are actually looking forward to training people to go out and teach first aid at work courses, obviously to charge for this, and the money would then be generated to be reinvested within the ambulance service for the future of the Berkshire Ambulance Service, for the personnel, for equipment, for future development of the whole structure from base upwards.
So it's let's just get it clear. It is you would go out into the market, as it were, but in a non-profit making way.
Well, obviously...
Except for the service.
Yeah, except for the service. All the profits would be for the ambulance service.
Fine. I just make 2 points. One is that I ask you to think, as a taxpayer yourself, of inheriting a lot of public capital and resources and then using it as the basis for the private generation of finance, even though I totally applaud your sentiments in wanting to see that that goes back into the service.
What's wrong with that?
I don't think it'd quite work out like that. And the second point is this. There is a better offer, if you like. Since your concern is about the quality of the ambulance service, quite rightly so, we are committing immediately an additional £25 million for the purchase of another 500 ambulances, new ambulances, properly equipped. And obviously, too, we've got commitment to the improvement of training and career structures in the ambulance service. So we get, for instance, more paramedics in the ambulance service, which, as you know, as an experienced ambulanceman, will be of benefit. What I'm saying is that because of a different scale of commitment to the National Health Service and an understanding of the crucial part that has to be played by this most critical of all emergency services, we want to see a rise in the quality, and we don't think that that system ought to have to rely upon private income generation in order to see that there are funds available for that which should be publicly provided.
But Mr. Kinnock, what the suggestion is, that I'm sure viewers and listeners will be interested, he's suggesting that you take the public funds, yes, in the Trust Hospital, you then, using your initiative, generate private income straight back into a public service which is thereby improved.
Well, it's presuming a flow of resources that I don't think there's any very adequate market analysis, as it were. And secondly, if it is the case that ambulance personnel want to give their time in order to improve first aid training, industrial concerns and so on, and anything that they get from that put back into the ambulance service or other parts of the health service, nobody's ever going to stop them doing that. What I don't want is a dependency upon that kind of arrangement when we know that an emergency service might ultimately depend on their success in the market.
Just come back in on that once, Mr. Patterson.
Yes, I mean, I like what Mr. Kinnock says, but obviously each health authority is not going to have a bottomless pit. And the ambulance service has always been the Cinderella service. Absolutely, where the health authorities account to. Now, if the hospitals within the health authority keep overspending, Mr. Kinnock is surely not going to keep bailing them out and saying, well, you can't have this, you can't have that, you know, you've got the ambulance service to look after. Is he rather going to shut down wards and put extra ambulance crews on the road, or is once again the ambulance service going to stay the Cinderella service?
No, and the ward closures, of course, are particularly a phenomenon of recent years under the Conservative government because of their financing arrangements and the way in which cumulatively, year on year, we've had the awful difficulties of underfunding. Much better is to introduce our system of performance agreements, which, if you want to analyse them, you will see, make sure not only that there are more resources, but that the resources available can be better spent in order to stop that emergency of underfunding arising particularly in the last 3 months or so of the financial year.
Mr. Patson, thank you very much. And just to remind you of the number, if you would like to get through to Mr. Kinnock for your election call, the number to ring is 071 799 5000. And we move on now to John Lawson, who rings from Glasgow. Your election call to Neil Kinnock.
Mr. Kinnock, why have you already decided to have proportional representation for a Scottish Parliament, but not for the House of Commons?
Thanks very much, Mr. Lawson. You will know, being a Scot obviously and phoning from Glasgow, of the work undertaken over past years by the Scottish Convention, which was intended to be an all-party, indeed a multi-organisational institution that included the churches, the trade unions, business, as well as the political parties. Sadly, the Scottish Nationalists and the Conservative Party in Scotland chose not to join the convention, but nevertheless I think it's recognised that its work has been extremely valuable and involved a wide degree of public consultation. There's also the case that I don't think anybody, whatever their political opinions, can fail to understand the general expression of majority opinion in Scotland. So the work of consultation and the work of analysis has not only been done very thoroughly over a period of years, it's been done on a very non-partisan basis, which means that when Professor Raymond Plant, chairing the working party that I set up, examined the future proposals relating to a Scottish Parliament, I think it was justifiable for him to conclude and to recommend to the party in Britain generally and in Scotland particularly that a form of proportional representation be used in order that the breadth of opinion, political opinion in Scotland would be guaranteed a place in that Parliament. It would have been very easy for us to accept that we establish a Parliament and there was a Labour hegemony forever and a day. We didn't do that because we believe in fair representation and fair government, and that's why we're proposing that in our Parliament bill we'll be including that commitment and provision for proportional representation in Scotland.
Does that meet
none
your
of
point,
those
Mr.
conditions.
Lawson? Sorry, none of those conditions.
Last phrase. Sorry, Mr. Lawson, just one last tiny point. None of those considerations about the breadth of consultation or the systematic approach to the issue that have applied in Scotland apply yet to the generality of the United Kingdom.
Well, I presume that you agree with the Constitutional Convention's findings, but why weren't all these inquiries done prior to the election? This isn't a new idea. Proportional representation has been around for a long time. The idea has. Why wait until after the election? Nobody knows what you're going to do. If you agree with the Constitutional Convention, you agree with PR for Scotland, why haven't you done this prior to the election?
What is constitutionally different about England or the rest of the United Kingdom that would make you so uncertain about it when you are so clear now about Scotland?
I just tried to make clear at some length, actually, and I apologise for the length of the response, that there has been that analysis, that public debate and that consultation undertaken in Scotland, which is required before any kind of major constitutional change is proposed, whether it be devolution to a parliament in Scotland or a change in the electoral system. My anxiety has been to try to ensure that we could not only stimulate, we didn't have to stimulate the debate, it's already on, but inform the debate by a body of work and analysis, drawing on international experience as well as looking at what we wanted to sustain in Britain, that's made possible by the work of the Plant Committee, will be enhanced when there's a Labour government by widening the membership of the Plant Committee. Now, I think it's very important because this sounds a pious thing to say, but it happens to be true. I think that decisions about the future form of election, of representation and of government in Britain is rather too important to be a partisan consideration. We've really got to spread it out.
You personally clearly believe that it's a good thing for Scotland. You must feel very tempted to tell the caller that when you're Prime Minister, as someone who would have, if you were Prime Minister, would have great influence in this matter, you must be terribly tempted to tell them, given that you're a man of strong opinion in most matters, what your opinion is.
Well, I've got strong opinions, but what I said at the outset of the work that's being undertaken is that it's got to be determined on the basis of how we improve the quality of government and representation, if change would improve it. That's had to be the basis. If I'd introduced the basic partisan consideration of this is where I stand and this is what I'm looking for, I think it would have been a different kind of debate. I'm looking forward to the outcome and the recommendations, because I would like to give my conclusive opinions too, as you can well imagine.
And you have strong opinions and you have a view.
Sure.
But you're going to keep it absolutely quiet until the very end of the day.
Insofar as that's possible, because I truly want this analysis and debate to be on the basis of what works, what doesn't work, what is good, what wouldn't be good, and for people then to make up their minds on the basis of the best possible information.
Mr. Lawson, thank you. And now Benjamin Sood, who rings from Grantham in Lincolnshire.
Good morning, Mr. Kinnock.
Hello, Mr. Sood.
We have witnessed in the 60s and 70s, during the Labour government, that the unions became so powerful that they walked all over the government. This only resulted in substantial loss of orders, especially from the Middle East and north coast of Africa. People like myself and many others had to put rescue plans to go and renegotiate the orders and accept penalty clauses. We are at the moment in the midst of recession. The only way we are going to come out of it is to keep the unions in order.
Well,
could you possibly answer me two small questions? One is, what is so different now as far as unions are concerned compared to the 60s and 70s? And secondly, would you be strong enough to make sure that this kind of incident never happened again?
Thank you, Mr. Sood. I must say that if all we had to do is to come out of recession was to keep the unions in order, I think that the unions who are suffering grievously because of the rising unemployment would be more than glad to be kept fully in order. I wish that the path out of recession only rested on that, but that's beside the point. On your basic questions, the best way to answer it, I think, is to say what our plans are. We will ensure that any action that's taken, proposed to be taken, by any group of trade unionists is dependent entirely on a ballot. Secondly, that there cannot be and will not be any mass picketing or flying pickets. And thirdly, we'll be introducing a system of industrial courts, very much like those that operate in the rest of the European community, where of course the industrial relations record is very good, that ensures that if an individual has a grievance against a trade union or against an employer, there is recourse to the courts, or if an employer or a union have a dispute with each other, there is the court there, which will also have conciliation powers. Now that puts us into the mainstream of the European community. It safeguards the civil right, which in a democracy people must have, to organize to withdraw their labor, subject to a democratic ballot, and it also ensures a stability of the kind that we haven't enjoyed very frequently in Britain because of the nature of our system. We're looking for progress in that, and insofar as the law can assist it, those laws will be introduced.
Mr. Sood, thank you very much. I'm going to move on because, Mr.
Sure.
Kinnock, we've got so many calls of people trying to get through. I want to get through as many as we possibly can. Janet Barnes now from Hull.
Good morning, Mr. Kinnock. I work in a bank and recently have been paying in, people have been paying in dividends from their shares in utility companies. The vast majority have been from ordinary working people and pensioners. Could you please tell me what is going to happen to monies invested by people if Labour take the water, gas and electricity companies back into public ownership?
Well, we're not going to. We are going to have a different system of public control and regulation, which is not untypical elsewhere in the European countries and in the Nordic countries, but we won't be taking them back into ownership. So the people who currently have shares will retain those shares and will continue to earn the dividends that are appropriate and to act like normal shareholders.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We'll move straight on to David McClintock from Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. Hello, Mr. McClintock.
Mr. Kinnock.
Mr. McClintock, good morning.
The Labour Party expect people to vote for them when the beliefs and ideals have held for years. They've changed overnight just because they weren't popular anymore. If the Labour government is elected, how can we be sure that you won't change your minds again overnight?
I think that I've tried to demonstrate over these years, when I've been working to change the policies of my party, that the purpose wasn't simply to court popularity, but to ensure that the policies of the party were relevant to the realities that the people of this country had to meet and the future that they were going to face. And that's because the first duty of a political party, above all others, that seeks to represent people is to be representative of the people. Now, in some respects, it was a tough struggle that had to take place, and a lot of arguments had to take place, and a lot of organisation had to go into it. But I'm very proud that I've done it. And having secured it and knowing that our policies are directly relevant in every respect to the present and to the foreseeable future, and we want the power to put those policies into the service of the nation, you can be absolutely certain that there will be fidelity to those policies and to the commitments we've made to the people of this country.
There it is, Mr. Clintock. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, it's just a point on defence and so forth in Europe. I can't see them changing. You know, people who've lived by ideals for so long, changing the complete ideals just overnight.
Mr. Kinnock has answered that.
Yes, can I just make a fair point to make? That's true of people who I respect, for instance, as pacifists. That is an ideal. But having never been a pacifist, my argument relating to defence was always that there was a continuing arms build-up, that logjam could never be broken, and so a particular set of actions was advocated, and I sought to implement that. I proved to be wrong. There was another way of doing it, and I think that the world will always owe a great deal to Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev particularly, and also to George Bush, in seizing the opportunities that existed for securing that negotiated disarmament and a change of relationships between East and West. It changes the context in which we work, and it changes the basis on which policy has to apply.
But Mr.
That's why and how we've changed the policy to ensure the most effective and secure defence for our country and proper alliance, a loyal alliance with our allies, and also a contribution to trying to secure greater stability and peace in the world.
But Mr. McClintock's point is partly addressed to you personally. You were a passionate advocate of unilateral nuclear disarmament during the Cold War with the Soviet threat and so on. Now, with the end of the Cold War, you are saying that you are an equally passionate advocate of retaining nuclear weapons. It's that doubt that he clearly has that you might go back the other way again.
Well, my passion has been for security in the world. It still is. And the question that poses itself to everybody who thinks about it is how best do you think you can achieve that security? I did think that it could be best achieved by pursuing a particular course. And I'm ready to admit, as I have for several years, that that was wrong. And consequently, the new circumstances and the facility now made available by the actions of statesmen who I respect means that we can better secure that safety for the world and that stability of the world by adopting different policies and sticking to those policies, which we will.
Mr. McClintock, thank you very much. And now, Alan Brown from Dagenham in Essex.
What I'd like to ask is, the Labour Party manifesto says it's going to maintain the difference between public sector and private sector in wage claims. How does it aim to control inflation and interest rate rises if, say, if someone in the public sector is on £80 a week and someone in the private sector gets £100 a week and they get a 10% rise, it'd have to be 12.5% for the public sector to maintain the difference of £20.
Thanks very much, Mr. Brown. Can I first of all say that the interest rate rises under Labour have always been, on average, about 2% lower than under the Conservative government. And that's because we've never resorted to, and never will resort to, the single club of high interest rates in order to try and manage the activity in the economy. So if I can just set that to one side and attend to the basic question that you asked about our commitment to try to ensure, indeed, to ensure within the necessary budgetary disciplines that there isn't a widening gap between the level of incomes in the private sector and the level of incomes in the public sector. I think it's important that we seek to do that, because if there is a constant and increasing lagging between the general level of incomes in the private sector and that in the public sector, we get the demoralization, the rundown of services, the loss of qualified people, which of course undermines the quality of life and the standard of living of everybody. I would like to be able to say that we could close the gap. We haven't done that, because we recognize that that would be a massive commitment that could not be discharged over the foreseeable future. That's why we've made what I consider to be a realistic commitment, realistic both in terms of the size of the commitment and realistic in terms of trying to retain in the public sector, which we all use, people of quality without taking the risk of them moving elsewhere and undermining the basic public services that we all need.
Is that all right for you, Mr. Brown?
But he still didn't really tell me how he aims to keep the interest rates and the inflation rate down. Because if, for example, private sector get 10% this year, and public sector had to have 12.5% to keep the differences. Next year, private sector go for maybe 13%.
Leapfrogging upwards is what the call is suggesting.
Yes, I completely understand the point. But if I can put it to you like this, that obviously we've got a whole range of anti-inflationary policies that will apply in every sphere, obviously in the attitude that we take to public sector pay as well, and we've made that clear. But if I put it to you like this, situation none of us want to get into, but this is how it would work. Supposing the general level of private sector incomes was to increase by 6%. The consequence of that would be, of course, that whilst people were getting higher incomes, they would also be paying higher taxes, not because the tax rate has changed, but because they were paying more taxes on their income, which would in turn be available for the funding of the public sector, including public sector wages. Now, the gap wouldn't have narrowed, but at least the rise in wages could be funded. We don't want that situation. We want small levels of wage increase that carry their value because of low inflation. And then both people in the private sector and the public sector will naturally be beneficiaries.
Mr. Brown, thank you. Yvonne Anthony now from Bridgewater in Somerset. Your election call to Mr. Kinnock.
Thank you. Mr. Kinnock.
Good morning.
I'm an active trade unionist. Can you please explain how a minimum national wage would not cost jobs and lead to inflation and rising prices? Are you actually telling us to cancel negotiated pay structure agreements with companies? If so, I suggest this could be your first split with the unions.
I'm not asking you, thanks very much for the question, to cancel anything at all. What I'm saying is that the basis of negotiation will be that minimum rate of $3.40 an hour. Now, you may have heard me saying earlier that in the unionized and non-unionized sectors, in the big business and small business, and in the private and public sectors in France, the consequence was not to generate additional adult unemployment. And I'm certain that that will be the case here. I'm sure too, I don't know whether you were involved.
She's talking, as I understand it, and you can correct me, you're talking about preserving differentials, are you not?
Yes, I am. To keep the question short, I cut out the word differentials, but they are there, and I think Mr. Kinnock would have to agree that if he was at the minimum, middle or top level of a pay structure that had been negotiated and agreed with companies over a number of years, that if someone else gets an increase in pay, it's automatic that those differentials are preserved. The only way of doing it is increasing everyone up the ladder, and that usually, in fact, invariably results in the people at the bottom of the ladder losing their jobs.
Thanks. Could I ask what kind of industry or service you're involved in?
I'm not working at the moment. I haven't worked since last December, but I was working in the private sector of manufacturing industry.
Yes. You see, we've had this argument, and it's an argument that is based on a realistic attitude. But I do have to say that I wonder how many wage structures are organized or negotiated according to the people that are on the bottom. For instance, I used to have a discussion a couple of months ago with colleagues who are in manufacturing trade unions, possibly the one that you belong to. And I had to say to them, well, how many skilled people have their wages negotiated on the basis of what the fellow who sweeps up the canteen is getting paid? And I think that that illustrated the point. The Amalgamated Engineering Union, before the amalgamation, of course, had strong reservations about the national minimum wage. And then they calculated and discovered that the national minimum wage would affect about 5,000 of their members out of the 500,000 or so, 600,000 or so that they had at the time. And all of those members, all of them, were women. Now, frankly, on the basis of international experience and on the basis of so many wage structures in Britain, and on the basis of the fact that very few people on the middle or the top are organizing their wages and negotiating their wages on the basis of where people are at the bottom, I think that it's realistic to say that your fears may not be realized, and indeed the negotiation opportunities that you have might indeed be improved.
You say may not. Do you mean may not be realized, or do you give a commitment that they will not be realized?
I'm certain that they won't be, because that's been the experience elsewhere, and was also the experience,
we'll
of
go
course,
back to Yvonne Anthony
with
now.
equal pay.
Let's go back to Yvonne Anthony.
Sorry.
Mr. Kinnock, you're wrong, because the majority of trade unions negotiate their pay structures with companies on a percentage basis, certainly in the southwest. And you have just admitted that 5,000 of members of the engineering union would have been brought into this trap. Now, I'm sorry, but the pay structures are laid out that if you have an increase up the ladder, Those people are paid the extra money for one thing, ability and qualification. Now, it means that they should be able to absorb additional work and additional responsibility and some of the work of the lower paid. I'm a woman, Mr. Kinnock. I know what happens. We are hit hard. Women are generally. But
yes, that's true.
You are doing nothing at all to help us. You will simply destroy jobs.
Yvonne Anthony, just let me check with you. Are you saying that even if there are only a very small number of people, either in the union within that deal or in the plant, or however it may apply, who are on the minimum wage, that everyone above that will preserve the exact differential?
Yes.
Well, that's quite difficult to sustain, but could I just ask you, Ms. Anthony, were you working or a trade unionist when equal pay was introduced?
Yes.
And do you recall that at that time, precisely these warnings were offered, indeed more so, because by definition, equal pay had its basic effect, indeed its whole impact, on the relative pay of men and women, and that we heard many warnings that there was going to be an eradication of women's employment. And will you also confirm from your experience in industry that the opposite has actually occurred?
No, Mr. Kinnock, I actually worked for a company at that time that made 25% of its female workforce redundant.
Would you confirm then that the overall level of women's employment has immensely increased since the time of the Equal Pay Act, indeed under the period of government of both governments, Labour and Conservative?
Only because the companies have been in a situation where they're able to offer more employment and women have been more available for employment. I think that what you're doing is doing nothing at all for women. I'm sorry, Mr. Kinnock, your policy is wrong.
Yvonne Anthony, thank you for making that call. We seem to have got roles reversed at that point. We'll go back to the normal role and go to a caller,
right
Peter Spence from York. Your election call to Mr. Kinnock.
Mr. Kinnock.
Mr. Spence, good morning.
Good morning. Repeatedly, you have said during interviews that if your party is elected, you will not devalue the pound or leave the ERM. The city and most financial experts think if you are elected, then there will be a run on the pound. If so, will you put interest rates up? And if you do you not agree that mortgage rates will also have to be increased immediately?
We will not devalue the pound. We will do what is necessary to hold the pound in the exchange rate mechanism, and indeed the current government has given precisely that undertaking. I think you may or may not have seen last week there was a statement from fund managers, who of course are the people who control more of the movement of money than any others in the British economy, and they took the view that it would be foolhardy and completely unnecessary for there to be the kind of movement that you describe, not only because they know that Labour, as John Smith and I have made absolutely clear, will not permit a devaluation of the pound, but also because they know that because we are partners and participants in the exchange rate mechanism, it isn't a case now of taking on one government, as it were, but as one of the commentators put it, taking on the exchange rate mechanism.
The caller allowed, Mr. Kinnock, the caller allowed that you had made very clear your position on that. His question was that if there is a run on the pound, are you prepared to raise interest rates?
Like the present government, we have said that we will do what is necessary because we do not believe there is any refuge or help for the British economy in letting the pound slide.
And do you accept also that if you did have to raise interest rates, it would be pretty catastrophic for the economy?
I'm not going to speculate on that any more than anybody else in this position, whether currently in government or in opposition is willing to do so. But we've made it very clear that we take a responsible and strict attitude towards affairs, and that's a basis on which we'll work.
That an answer to your question, Mr. Spence?
No, it isn't really, you see, because the situation is that Mr. Kinnock said they will have to take whatever steps are necessary. There is only one necessary step, and that is to increase interest rates. And in fact, all the previous Labour chancellors have in fact devalued sterling in 1929, 1945, 1964, and 1974. So the city just can't trust them.
But in entirely different circumstances. And it wasn't we, of course, Mr. Spence, who let the pound float. And it isn't we who have ever levied, for over a very long period of time, 15% interest rates. Repossessions weren't rising under a Labour government, neither were bankruptcies that were occurring simply because of the crushing burden of interest rates used as the single instrument, as Ted Heath called it, the one club of government policy. If you want to compare records, I think that ours stands us in good stead, and the future will be even better.
Mr. Spence, thank you very much. And now, Roy Newland from Epping in Essex.
Good morning, Mr. Kinnock.
Good morning, Mr. Newland.
We've all witnessed the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe and the economic crisis that now faces that part of the world following years of socialist rule. Here in the West, socialism is widely discredited, and we now see the threatened collapse of the French socialist government with the recent resignation of their Prime Minister. Why do you believe that a socialist government is what Britain needs now that we're on the verge of coming out of a recession?
I believe that a Labour government here is needed because only we will make the proper commitment to getting our country out of recession with an investment-led recovery. Only we will put the proper emphasis on manufacturing industry, on the improvement of skills, on giving incentives for new investment in new industrial capacity. And only we are committed to using the resources of the nation as the country wants them to be used, primarily for additional investment and for better public services rather than for tax cuts. Now that's the implication of our values, at which the centre of which is a commitment to individual liberty made real by the quality of opportunity for employment and the quality of community services.
Is that socialist?
When you speak, oh, it certainly is in the best British tradition of socialism, by definition. But when you speak of the collapse of socialism in the Eastern Bloc, we could have a very interesting discussion
we haven't got time
on whether we've ever regarded those people who describe themselves as socialists and used the secret police and the torture chamber and the absence of democracy to oppress people.
I want to get
back. I think you'll find that we've been antagonists of that for a long time.
Mr. Newland, have a brief response to that. Very brief, if you would.
Thank you, yes. Those of us who've lived through Labour governments in the past will recall that union interests dominated our future, and there were high wage demands, which, coupled with higher personal taxation, we could expect to gain. This would bring back higher prices and therefore higher inflation.
And now I'm going to give the final, very brief word, if you would, to Mr. Kinnock.
Thanks very much. I wouldn't describe it as perfection. But we didn't have a balance of trade deficit. We didn't have interest rates at the level we've had in the last 13 years. We never maintained 3 million people unemployed. And so for all the woes and difficulties, I have to say that there were a lot of ways in which our economy and our society were rather healthier in those years.
Mr. Kinnock, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your call, Mr. Newland. Thank you for all your calls this morning. Tomorrow morning, for the last election call, if you ring 071 799 5000, it will be your election call to John Major for the Conservative Party. But for this morning, from Mr. Kinnock and from myself, a very good morning to you.
Election Call was presented by Jonathan Dimbleby and produced by Nick Utechin. The editor was Anna Caraher. And as Jonathan said, tomorrow morning, our last election call is your chance to phone John Major, the Prime Minister and leader of the Conservative Party, with your election questions.